And the third book is called Slaughter of the Dissidents, and that is the subject of this presentation here. And I usually try to sell the books for a discount. If you look on Amazon, my Slaughter of the Dissidents book, the cheapest you can get it for is $25 and $4 postage. So you pay $29 for it. Here we're offering it for $15, so you can save some money. And interestingly, on Amazon, if you get on Amazon and look for my book, you will find that the most expensive is about $78. So I've had people actually buy books here and then turn around and sell them on Amazon. So I don't encourage you to do that, but I guess if you want to, you can do that. Okay, that's the book. Actually, that there is the cover we rejected. This is the cover that we eventually went with. And that's the cover we rejected. Okay, a couple of scriptures here to try to relate this to Christianity. Number one, it's clear the scriptures teach creationism. And one scripture, Matthew 19:4, in the beginning the Creator made the first humans, male and female. And that was Jesus' words, indicating that if Jesus said it, well, it certainly has validity. Some people try to discount the things Paul said. Well, that's Paul's opinion. And one can claim that, I guess, about certain scriptures, but Jesus himself made it very clear that humans were created by God. So this is a central teaching of Christianity. Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, it is no longer good for anything. And that is a problem that this lecture focuses on. We are to be the salt of the earth. And that's hard to be the salt of the earth when we're risking our livelihood for being such, which is the theme of this presentation. Luke 11:33-36, no man, when he has lit a lamp, puts it in a cellar, nor under a basket, but on a stand, that those who enter may see the light. And of course, we know that if we have information that's of value to somebody else, we have an obligation to give that information to them. And we have Christianity, the light of Jesus' message, and therefore Christians in general feel obligated to share that light with other people. And in many schools and many states, if you share that light with other people, you risk losing your career. Okay, history of the project. In 1979, I was let go from Bowling Green State University. I was there, by the way, for 7 years. I had the record of the largest number of publications of any faculty in my department, and I had excellent teaching evaluations, and I also had an excellent record of service. Tenure is supposed to be based on those three criteria, and there's no question that I met those three criteria, but nonetheless, I was terminated openly because they were concerned about my disillusion with Darwinism. And they made that very clear. That was in writing. That wasn't a secret. And when this happened, it hit the papers, and Christianity Today did an article, a number of other journals like Conservative Digest did an article, and as a result, I received letters and phone calls, and it became clear to me that this was not a problem that I alone faced. It became very clear that many, many people face the same problem. In fact, it didn't take me long at all, and I had 30 or 40 cases that I was aware of. And eventually, I interviewed about 300 academics and scientists, and I found all face some clear discrimination. Not necessarily termination of their career, but that was a problem. So in my research, I ended up with 5 file cabinets full of documentation. So it's clearly a clear problem. It's also, no question, it's illegal. You cannot discriminate on the basis of one's religion. You cannot do that. That's illegal. But I found that colleges and universities were commonly getting away with doing this, and nothing was done. So I began to write articles about this problem, and eventually I ended up with a book, My Slaughter of the Dissidents, and I now have close to complete 5 volumes of Slaughter of the Dissidents. The one that's out there is about 1,000 pages, and it has about it's 500 pages, and it has about 1,000 footnotes. So it's well documented. And I have documentation such as emails from one faculty to another stating we're going to terminate so-and-so because of religion. Or they'll often say because they accept the personal view of God, that God is a a personal God and not just a concept. A lot of scientists use the term God as kind of a concept. Like, a number of people, like Steve Hawking is probably the best example. To him, the word God is a concept which has nothing to do with a personal God, as Christians believe in. And the second volume is close to 98% finished, and that should be out within a couple of months, I hope. So I found in my research that denial of tenure was a big problem, denial of degrees, denial of promotion, based on religion. Community colleges and technical colleges, it was less of a problem. You go to the four-year universities, it was more serious of a problem. You go to universities that offered graduate degrees, research universities, it was the most serious problem of all. And so the higher you go up the academic ladder, the more serious a problem it is. And the documentation is important because when I first started talking about this, people said, oh no, people would not fire you because you don't accept Darwinism. They can't do that. That's wrong. And so I had a hard time convincing people it was indeed happening. So I wanted to carefully document indeed what was happening, and that's what I did. And basically the problem they ran into was they had questioned Darwinism, and in the background often was their Christianity. In fact, hardly any of the cases, they didn't come out and say, well, we're firing you because you're a Christian. That didn't come up. What came up was, we're firing you because, or we're terminating you because you question Darwinism. And everybody knows Darwinism is true. Therefore, they would often say things like, well, you're incompetent. And in my own case, there was an article in a magazine which basically said, someone like Dr. Bergman, who denies Darwin, should not be allowed to lead young men into science because, well, Darwin's true, everybody knows it's true, and therefore, if you deny Darwin, something is wrong. And the interesting thing is that when I was at Bowling Green State University, part of my time there, I was an atheist. Why? Because, well, my father was an atheist. He was very involved in the Unitarian movement, which is primarily agnostics and atheists today, at least. And for several other reasons, of course, studying evolution, I became convinced it was valid. I saw the pictures in the books, the textbook we used, of transitional forms. And here's, Neanderthal man, and here's Peking man, and here's, Australopithecine, and looked like primitive men to me, and looked like they had a nice, neat set of fossils which led up to us. And so, glancing at the pictures and reading the subtext, it looks like they have the evidence. Never really explored the evidence very carefully at that point, but it looked pretty convincing to me. And so if evolution was true, it puts God out of a job. Most people who are theists believe in God because of the evidence of the creation. I've done surveys, many, many surveys, and they ask people, why you believe in God? And the predominant reason is people say, well, because of the creation. If we have such a creation, there must be a creator. How could what we see around us in the natural world exist without a creator? So therefore, there must be a creator. And this is the reason people give. And so therefore, when you knock out the idea of a creator, you knock out the idea of God as a creator, well, what's the point of believing in God? And many people realize that, and therefore, God no longer has a job, so why believe in God? What has He done? And therefore, I was convinced, as many others, and I became involved in the atheist movement, by the way, and I was convinced, as well as many others, that we don't need a God to explain how we got here. Evolution explains it. Evolution explains it quite well, we were convinced. But in time, though, I became disillusioned with atheism for a number of reasons. One was that I found many atheists, well, they behave like atheists. They were not always very nice people. They would constantly complain about the evils in the world, but they wouldn't do anything about it. How many hospitals do you know of that were set up by atheists? How many charitable organizations, period, were set up by atheists? All the charitable organizations that I knew of, or at least most, were set up by Christians. Christians are the ones, in fact, studies have shown this, that Christians are the ones that give money to all kinds of charities. Not just churches, but all kinds of charities. And I didn't see this among atheists. Atheists seem to feel that if you eliminate all the Christians, or at least eliminate Christianity, the world would be paradise. And I thought, well, I may not agree with Christianity, but I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. And one thing that especially struck me, and this I'll never forget, when Madeleine Mary O'Hara, who was probably the most famous atheist in the United States for years, when her son became a Christian, she said she's never going to talk to him again. And someone said, well, that's not very loving of a mother. I mean, he's your son. You should still have communication with him. And then she shot back and said, look, I'm not a Christian. I can hate my enemies if I want to. I don't have to love them like Christians do. Christians have to love their enemies, and I don't have to, and I'm not going to. And that really struck me. This is her son. And why would she reject him just because he became a Christian? And I saw that attitude all too often, and so I became disillusioned with atheism, and I decided to explore the evolution question. Because if evolution was true, well, then I guess maybe Christians are good people, etc., but I'm not going to become a Christian because it doesn't have the facts behind it. So therefore I explored the evolution issue, because if evolution was wrong, the alternative would be, of course, we have a creator. We must have a creator, because what explanations are there for us? Basically two. We are created by evolution, natural selection, accumulation of copying errors called mistakes, mutations, and therefore we are, according to evolution, the accumulation of lots of mistakes. That's what evolution says. Evolution teaches, orthodox evolution, teaches basically that we start out with goo, we went through the zoo, and we end up with you. So from the goo to you by way of the zoo. That's what they teach, from the goo to you by way of the zoo. And therefore, I realize that if evolution is not true, it at least forces me to look at the possibility that there is a creator. And then if I recognize there's a creator, then it would force me to ask whether or not that creator would like me to do something, or whether there's something I can do to please that creator, which led me into exploration of different religions. I go through this in detail in the book Persuaded by the Evidence, so I'll just briefly mention it here. So anyways, I was going through that while I was at Bowling Green State University, and I began to question more and more Darwinism, and I began to talk about this with my colleagues. Well, they didn't like the direction that I was moving, and they made that very clear. And as a result, I ended up losing my career in teaching at that level. And in my book, The Slaughter of the Dissidents, I documented most of the cases that are mentioned in the film Expelled. Hopefully you all saw that film. Okay? A lot of people say, well, how do we know these people were let go because of their involvement in Darwinism? How do we know that's the problem, that they had problems with Darwinism? Well, I document that very, very carefully in my book with hundreds of footnotes and references to original sources. And by the way, Expelled really opened the door for what I was saying, because until Expelled came out, people were still very doubtful that what I was saying was true. Yeah, a couple might lose tenure, but people lose their jobs for all kinds of reasons. How do you know it's because the conflict between their conclusions about Darwin and the academic establishment? And in my book, I indeed document that very carefully. And so there's a website, by the way, called Expelled Exposed, which is supposed to try to expose the film Expelled. And what I found is that the website Expelled Exposed needs to be exposed. And because they just were totally wrong in their conclusions and very inept. And this bothered me, not only among the website here, but also among atheists. I found that they were not really that scholarly. They said so many things that I knew from my own research were simply not true, just simply false. One thing that bothers me to this day was World War II occurred because Hitler was a devout Catholic and the leading Nazis were devout Catholics. And if they weren't Catholics, if they were atheists, we wouldn't have had a World War II. And they actually made that claim. And that, of course, is ludicrous, as if you study the Nazi development, and Hitler especially, you'll find that that's ludicrous. Hitler, by the way, was determined to destroy the Christian church. And he first started out with the Jews, not because of their religion so much, but because of their race. And he didn't care whether or not you were a Catholic priest. If you had a Jewish great-grandparent, you were a Jew and off to the concentration camps. Although he made exceptions, he had to make exceptions because a number of the leading generals in World War I were Jewish. And so you can't send many of your leading generals, or at least a number of them, to the concentration camps. And so they started making all kinds of exceptions, which the whole idea of the racism which he used becomes ludicrous. And it came down to, and I forget whether it's Himmler or Goebbels who said this, or Hitler, but one of those said, I'll determine who is a Jew and who is not. And they determined a lot of these leading generals were not Jewish, even though by their definition they were, and therefore they served in the Nazi army. In fact, there's a whole book called Hitler's Jewish Generals, which details the cases of these individuals who served in Hitler's army. So anyways, Hitler was very, very opposed to Christianity because, in his words, Christianity is bastard of Judaism. And he felt really that Christianity had ruined Germany. And so that's another reason why he wanted to destroy Christianity. So to claim that he was a Christian was ludicrous and not accepted by any scholar. Okay, my conclusion from my research is very simply that an out-of-the-closet Darwin doubter will probably not survive in academia today. And that's primarily college, university level. It's possible, but highly unlikely. And every time I speak to a group like this, I ask if you know anybody who's an out-of-the-closet Darwin denier, Darwin doubter if you prefer, or creationist, who is an out-of-the-closet who achieved tenure at a state college or university. Not a Christian college, but a state college or university. And I found out of speaking to thousands of people that I've located so far 3 that got tenure as out-of-the-closet Darwin deniers or Darwin doubters. So it's pretty clear that it's pretty unusual. But I have hundreds of cases of people who had problems with Darwinism and were denied tenure. So indeed, I can say that it's pretty much a rule. If you have a problem with Darwinism, you can realize your career is over. The problem primarily is not the government, it's not in the military, it's not in industry, it's not in business, it's primarily in academia. Why? Primarily because in academia they're concerned about what you believe because they realize those beliefs can end up in the classroom. In industry, they don't care what you believe because if you're producing your work, it's well done, it's sufficient to the standards and quantity and quality that they expect. They don't care if you believe the moon is made out of green cheese. They just don't care. They're concerned about your work. Same thing is true in many areas, like the military. They're concerned, are you a good soldier? So whether you believe in Hare Krishna or Jehovah or the great spaghetti monster, they don't care. As long as you're a good soldier. That's all they're worried about, primarily. That's not totally true, but that's primarily the case. Also, I found, by and large, it's only a few militant people that cause the problem. In my case, at Bowling Green State University, most of my faculty were in support of me. In the area I taught in, every faculty but one voted in favor of my staying at the university. This is in the area that I worked in. So almost everybody I worked with directly supported me. The problem was, in my case, 1 or 2 faculty that were very militant and very determined that someone like me is not going to stick around. Because I could lend doubts about Darwin and they didn't want that to happen. And you might ask at this point, why are people so concerned about whether you believe in Darwinism or not? Well, the main reason is that they know that evolution is the doorway to atheism. They know that. And when I was an atheist, they just pushed Darwinism constantly. It was in all the journals, and they talked about it a lot. That was a central concern among the atheist movement. And therefore, they realized that they've got to keep Darwin in the forefront. Otherwise, people are going to end up becoming Christians. And so they realized that the key to atheism, in many cases, is Darwinism. And so that's why it's so important. And also they realized that we have, as one Eugenie Scott specifically said, we have the better story. What is the atheist story? The atheist story is we appear, we're born, we live, we die, and that's it. And that's also the story of the universe. The universe appeared, the Big Bang, it exists, grows old, it dies, it disappears, and that's it. Nowhere ever in the universe will there be any life, anything but nothingness. And so we're a very short blip in the history of everything. And that's not a very nice story. Okay? Christians, though, believe we're born with a purpose. We have a purpose in living, that when you die, there's a purpose beyond that. There's a hope. There's a heavenly hope or earthly hope, or there's more than just this few years we have on the earth. That there's much more. And most all religions promise something beyond this life now. And they realize that that's a more appealing story. And also the second thing, which is really important, is that they realize that, as I do now, although it took me a while to figure this out, they realize that really they don't have a case for evolution. I tell people that evolution did not occur, it could not occur, and the science is very clear it did not and could not occur, and the conclusion is because of the science. And I know of a number of people who became Christians purely through evaluating evolution and realizing that evolution could not occur. Mutations are not going to build up and produce us. Mutations, in my area of medicine, we know clearly mutations virtually always cause problems. They don't improve us. They don't improve anything. And therefore, as a whole, and there's a few mutations which can be beneficial in limited circumstances, but by and large, you're not going to get people from the accumulation of mistakes. And then when I looked in the fossil record and vestigial organs, I mentioned a few minutes ago, when I looked into these areas, I found the fossil record does not support Darwinism. Every case I looked at, and I looked at many, I looked at turtles and fish and dinosaurs and birds I'm working on now, and flowers and plants and invertebrates. Every single case I looked at, it was clear. They appear in the fossil record, they're still around today, or they appear and they disappear. There's no evidence of evolution for any of these organisms. None. Turtles is a good example. The first turtle is unequivocally a turtle, and turtles are still around today. Bats are another example. The first bat is clearly a bat, and they're around today. Frogs is another example. The first frog in the fossil record is clearly a frog. There's no evidence of evolution of frogs, and they're around today. And that's true of every single animal that I looked at, and I've looked probably at, 30 or 40 different critters. Eventually, I hope to have like a 10-volume set documenting the evolution of all these organisms, showing indeed there's no evidence for evolution. And a few others I've looked at are marsupials, I've looked at duck-billed platypus, I've looked at kiwis, I've looked at echidnas, I've looked at quite a few animals. And we see the same thing over and over. They appear in the fossil record, they're still around, or they disappear. There's no evidence of evolution. So from all the grounds that I looked at, and I looked at quite a few, there's simply no evidence for evolution. And I think many scientists realize that, and therefore they don't want doubts to be raised in the minds of students that this worldview is not true. And that's one reason why they're so militant, and they are militant. They're so militant against those who recognize that Darwinism indeed did not and could not have occurred. Okay, moving on. So the problem is academia. And as I mentioned, industry and the military and so on, they don't care what you believe or what they think you believe. And I found in the cases in this book, at least, they were fired not for what they did, but for who they were. And let me give you an example. A lot of times they accuse people of teaching creationism, which the courts have ruled in many cases is illegal. So they said, well, you were teaching creationism. But when I looked into the cases, I found out they were not teaching creationism as you would assume. They were basically critiquing Darwinism. This is what they were fired for. In fact, none of the cases in Volume 1 was there any evidence that they were teaching creationism. What they were doing was lending doubts about Darwin, and that's how they got into trouble. And so, one, I guess, could fire someone because they were, quote, teaching creationism and get away with it. But that's not what they were doing. And they knew that would get them into trouble, and so therefore they limited their classroom time to pointing out some of the problems with Darwinism. And that's what got them into trouble. And I summarize that here. One case is kind of interesting because what happened is that there were concerns that this teacher was teaching creationism, and so the department chair and some of the faculty went to every single class that he taught to make sure he was not teaching creationism. And I talked to several of the people who were in his classroom, and they said, oh, he's a great teacher, the students love him, he had good evaluations, and better than I. Great teacher. They admitted this. Did he teach creationism? Well, no. Well, what was the problem? The problem was he was not a Darwinist, therefore he could not enthusiastically present Darwinism. And that's why we fired him. He told me that. I got it on tape. It's part of, pretty sure that's in this volume, where I talk about that. I quote these people, word for word, what they said. And so, in his case, he wasn't really even critiquing evolution. What he was is presenting Darwinism with less enthusiasm than you're supposed to, I guess. And that's why they let him go. And he was an excellent teacher, which they admitted. And I actually put all the student evaluations right in the book, and you can read what all the students had to say. And there's probably about, 8 or 9 pages. And all I can say, I wish I had such good student evaluations. They were just glowing. And in fact, I don't think anybody said a thing negative, if I recall. There might have been 1 or 2, but by and large, people said things like the best teacher here, and excellent teacher, and I hated biology, but now that I took, Dan Scott was his name, now when I took Dan Scott, I love biology, things like that. A lot of people looked at the title and they said, Slaughter, come on, no one's been killed. Well, actually, there have been some people killed, but not that many. Okay, why do you use the term slaughter? Well, several people, when they read the book, they said the term slaughter is too mild. What often happens is you lose your career. That's a problem because you spend 9 years, 4 years undergrad, 3 years master's degree, 2 or 3 years, 3 years for your PhD. You got typically 9 years, $100,000, $200,000 in loans and grants, often loans you have to pay back. It's difficult to lose a career when you spent that much time preparing for it. A more serious problem is that divorce and family problems occur. You gals probably aren't too thrilled about a husband who doesn't earn a living, right? And of course, husbands who go through this generally aren't in the best of moods. And when the husband's in a bad mood, who does he take it out on? His wife, yeah. And so therefore, and I've talked to a number of these people at length as to what happens in their marriage, and not uncommonly their marriages fail. And they say, yeah, I just really got upset, and I really wasn't upset at her, I was upset at the college, but I took it out on her and I shouldn't have, and that's what happens. And the scriptures state very clearly, a man who doesn't support his family is worse than one without the faith, right? And so therefore, supporting your family is important. And a lot of these people have a difficult time supporting their families. I mean, some got jobs at McDonald's and so on, but when you owe $100,000 in loans, when you have 3 kids and a wife, a mortgage to pay, you're not going to be able to do that on McDonald's wages. Okay, you can't do that. And I don't know, do McDonald's, do they pay for insurance, health insurance and so on? You don't have these benefits. And wives are very concerned about the needs of their family. And so therefore, divorce is not, I went through a divorce myself because of this. And in my case, my ex-wife remarried, and then he turned out to be an alcoholic and abused my kids severely and her. And my kids ended up in homes for battered children, and my wife ended up, my ex-wife, in a home for a battered child. She later on contacted me and said, that's the worst thing she ever did was to divorce me. So I guess I look pretty good compared to her second husband. But it affected me severely. In fact, it affected my son to the degree that he has left his country. He doesn't want to live here. He now lives in Norway. And the trauma was so great that he couldn't live in this country anymore. So he left, which is difficult for me because I don't see him a lot. Okay, and therefore, what happened to me actually is mild compared to what happened to some people. So it's a lot more complex than people assume. And my suggestion is just spend an hour on the phone with some of these people and let them tell you their story and what happened. It's not pretty at all. Here I mentioned this already. By the time, by the way, you get your doctorate and are teaching at a university, you're late 20s, early 30s. And so you're not a young man anymore. You're not a kid anymore. And your friends who didn't go to college, they have 10 years of experience and 10 years of saving money and 10 years of making payments on cars and houses. You graduate, you're 28, 29, 30 years of age, and how much savings do you have? Probably nothing. How much in debt are you? Probably quite a bit. Okay? And so it's not easy. And I mentioned this. And changing careers. That's difficult. When you spent 9 years in a college or a professor, there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to hire you. One, they realize if you get an offer to teach at a college, you'll probably quit. And most jobs, or many jobs that require a fair amount of training, you're worthless, or worse than worthless, for the first 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. How long does it take to train someone to do your job, for example? People can't walk in general and do it. It takes a while. In fact, many jobs, you really don't pay for your wages until you've been there for a year, 2, 3 years. And so therefore they're leery of hiring somebody who they believe is not going to stick with them. My stepdaughter owns a Subway, and we're encouraging her to hire some students just for the summer. And she said, look, Subway may seem simple. I mean, it's not rocket science, but it takes a month or two to train these people. By the time they're good at what they're doing and they're competent, then they leave and they go back to school. She says, I can't just hire people for the summer unless they've had experience. I hire people at the summer only if they've worked during the school year and they go off to college and they come back and then they have 2 or 3 years experience, and then I'll hire them. So even working at Subway, you have to have a certain level of skills to know what to do and how to do it. And there's a lot of things to learn. And you're not going to learn this in a week or 2 or 3. Interesting, a number of these people ended up in driving a truck. In fact, there were 4 or 5 PhDs who ended up driving truck for a living, and they used to get together and compare experiences. But if you think about it, not trying to put down truck drivers, because I know several PhDs who flunked truck driving school. If you think it's easy to drive a truck, get into a semi and drive one. Back one up. It's not easy. You have to be very coordinated. Eye-hand coordination has to be good. You have to be good at depth perception and so on to be able to drive a semi. It's not easy to do. And that's why 2 PhDs I know at least, they flunked truck driving school. They just couldn't do it. And it's not easy. Okay, so I'm not demeaning truck driving as an occupation. But on the other hand, when you have 9 years of school and then you end up driving a truck, that's a waste of a lot of money, your money as well as the state's. They estimate to get a PhD, you're talking about $500,000 investment. So the state has invested this money. So if you end up driving a truck, the state basically is wasting a lot of money. And that's what happens in these cases. Okay, moving on. What's my advice on this? Well, and this is controversial. Every time I present this, people say, I disagree. And that's okay. But my advice is stay in the closet. And it's hard to do, and people tell me that. I spoke at a medical school, and a couple of medical students said, I'm a Christian, I'm a young earth creationist. I can't stay in the closet. Well, then you risk ruining your career. In medical school, she was like a 3rd year. Although I must state that in medical school, I think you'll find among the least antagonism to creation than anywhere. And I 3 degrees from medical college, so I've had a lot of experience there. And the reason why is medical schools and people in medicine are concerned about helping people get well. And to some degree, like other occupations, they're really not that worried about what you believe. They're worried about whether or not you're effective in helping people get well. And I found in my own experience working on doing 3 master's degrees, which is about 8 years, about 2.5 years for each master's degree. And in medical school, by the way, you don't just take a bunch of courses and take a bunch of exams and go home. You spend hours in the laboratory. I remember spending many, many nights until 9, 10 o'clock in the lab doing your research and doing tissue preparation, for example, using the electron microscopy system, which is TEM and SEM, the other modes that we use to evaluate tissues and structures, small structures. And so you can spend a lot of time. So you're talking about 7, 8 years. And yet I never heard evolution, Darwin even mentioned ever, except in the context of stating that a gene is evolutionarily conserved. And all that means is that the gene is very similar in us and in worms and in cockroaches and in yeast. And many genes are identical or close to it in bananas and people, in yeast, and all the other eukaryotes. And of course they are for good reasons, because genes do the same thing in all those organisms, because all those organisms have to do very similar things like respirate and reproduce and so on. And the genes involved in respiration, surprise, are very similar in all mammals, and in fact in most eukaryotes except plants. And so you see a lot of similarities, which is an important point. Okay, I mentioned stay in the closet. And at least stay in the closet until you get your PhD. Now, we had a student here, Dr. Leslie, I think, who went to one school here, and he stayed in the closet until he got his PhD, and then he worked for Answers in Genesis, so now he can come out of the closet. And here's one of the exceptions. There are some that do get their PhDs and are out of the closet. Kurt Wise is one who got his PhD from Harvard under Gould, and he was out of the closet. Here's another one, Marcus Ross, and he got a PhD in paleontology, and he was out of the closet, and he earned the degree, and this feat gave him the front page of the New York Times. And that is not minor. To make the front page of New York Times, you're talking about something really outstanding. If you cured cancer, you'd probably get the front page. Okay? If you did just about anything else in medicine, you probably wouldn't get the front page. This is really important if you get the front page. He not only got the front page of the New York Times because they gave him an out-the-closet creationist a PhD, but he got the front, the top part, so when you saw the newspaper, you saw the article about him and his picture. So that's even more important than the bottom part. So you can see how unusual it is and how important it is as an out-of-the-closet creationist to get a PhD. And, by the way, there was a storm of letters to New York Times, as well as his advisors at the university where he got his PhD from, protesting the gall of giving a creationist a PhD. This is just, I can't deal with this, people said. People said things like, I'm not going to recommend your school to any of my students. That's it. None of my students am I going to recommend to go to your school, because you actually gave a PhD to an out-of-closet creationist.